Started with our agenda. Thank you for introducing each one of you. We're happy that you're here. The process for selecting reviewers was very rigorous. We had many qualified applicants, and really what spoke to us most in choosing each and every one of you was your depth and commitment to teaching literacy in Tennessee. So we are thrilled to have you here and thrilled to get this process started. So welcome. We will spend a bit of time talking about the review process, the overarching review process, and then we'll talk a little bit about our proposal template. That proposal template was sent in an email from me, so hopefully you have a hard copy or an electronic copy accessible as we talk through that. We're going to spend the bulk of our time talking about the rubrics that will be used to evaluate the proposal. And the purpose of this review in general is to really get you well vetted in the what. The what meaning the criteria, and not so much yet in the how we will evaluate the proposals. That will come with our later review training, our in-person training that we have scheduled in March, and we'll talk a bit about those details later today. So today is really an overview of these documents and an opportunity to just engage with what this criteria is so that everybody is on the same page with understanding the requirements in this regard. So we will take a break in between talking about our rubrics. It is a heavy lift, as you've probably seen with the rubrics that were sent out via email yesterday. And then we'll have an opportunity at the end to engage in next steps so that you all are clear on what we do from this point on until our next reviewer training. So again, our training objectives for today to deepen or develop or deepen understanding of the EPP literacy proposal review process. As you noticed, about half of our reviewers are EPP folks and about half are LEA folks, and many of those EPP reviewers have been actively engaged with our literacy network and various other trainings. And so there will be some content of this reviewer training that may sound familiar, but there is also additional information we want to make sure that everyone has a chance to think about and ask questions. Another objective for our training today is to familiarize with the EPP literacy proposal template and rubric criteria, as I just explained, and to really understand what those expectations are moving forward. So today, with our webinar norms, we hope that you are able to talk or to focus and minimize those distractions. We think that eliminating the microphone for this point on might be helpful with that, but we do want you to engage and be an active listener and contributor. Please think about using that chat feature if anything is unclear or that you have a question about. And finally, the idea of respecting, recognizing and appreciating individual differences and needs and assume positive intent. What we think about that, it was a very intentional design to bring EPPs and LEAs together as reviewers to evaluate these proposals, because each one of you brings a different and very valued perspective to this process, and we intentionally designed it that way and hope that you will respect each and one of those perspectives moving forward. So for today, those are our webinar norms, and we'll jump right into our review process overview. So the importance of a review, quality reviews are done to ensure that our proposals that our EPPs are submitting to show their alignment to the new EPP literacy standards are submitted and meet the expectations set by the Tennessee Department of Education. Clearly, you all have a deep understanding of literacy and have varied expertise in this area, and so Reviewers with this literacy expertise will support the department in determining whether the proposals will be adequately addressing these standards, in addition to the main tenets of teaching literacy in Tennessee. So again, and we'll talk a bit about this in, later on in the webinar, the proposal review process for these literacy proposals, this is a bit different than what EPPs are generally accustomed to doing. In the past, EPPs have taken a set of new standards and thought about how it aligns with their coursework and have submitted a matrix to show this alignment. But the depth that we're requiring, specifically through the comprehensive proposal questions, is really raising the bar. And within those questions, we're expecting to see that these main tenets of teaching literacy in Tennessee will be present within those proposals and within the revisions to those programs. Amy, go ahead.
For the California people are asking to take notes, and I'll just go over it.
Okay, so our standards context. These EPP literacy standards, which were sent out to you via email, and we sent actually the entire educator preparation policy and indicated which page numbers those literacy standards were for early elementary and special education programs, on what pages those were. So our focus today is just on early elementary and special education. These standards were adopted by the Tennessee State Board of Education in April of 2017, and to show alignment to these standards, EPPs will be engaging in this one-time proposal process that is required for any EPP that licensed teachers for initial licensure towards early elementary and special education. And again, as I had stated before, this proposal process, the expectations are much more substantive and go beyond compliance, and we'll get into some of those details about what that looks like shortly. So our timeline is April 15th is 2018. EPPs are aware that this is the due date for all proposals. And what will occur afterwards is, as you all are reviewing, the bulk of that review process will happen in April and May, with the expectation that EPPs will be notified of approval or revision by May 30th, 2018. If any revisions are required on the part of the EPP, they will have the opportunity to make those revisions during the round one and have about a month to do so, and resubmit these revisions by June 30th of 2018. If additional revisions are required, EPPs will have an additional chance for round two of revisions, which you notice is a much shorter window of about 2 weeks to make those revisions and resubmit to the department by July 15th, 2018. And the reason for this pretty rapid timeline is that the EPPs are expected to implement these standards within their programs beginning fall semester of 2018. Just one moment. apologies for that. We're working on getting the PowerPoint out to you all as we're hearing some requests for having that as this webinar is progressing. So we're working on that. So the EPP literacy standards, if you have a copy of these standards, a hard copy or an electronic copy, if you would mind turning that copy to, I believe it's page 19. Give everyone a chance to get there. Apologies, it's page 21 is when the literacy standards for early elementary and special education begin. So a few things to note with these standards. When they were created, there was a vested effort to ensure that these EPP literacy standards were aligned with the Tennessee academic standards. And I'm going to show you an example of that here briefly. On this slide, you can see that there's a standard for 1.3, vocabulary, knowledge, and acquisition. And this is the EPP literacy standard. And the standard reads, the educator candidates prepare students to determine or clarify meaning of unknown and multiple meaning words and phrases, et cetera, et cetera. And what you can see below this EPP literacy standard is that there's the foundational literacy standard, which comes right from Tennessee academic standards, with that exact same language of determining or clarifying the meaning of unknown and multiple meaning words and phrases. And so the difference here, even though that language is essentially verbatim, what the requirement is for EPPs is that they not only have to be prepared, the candidates not only have to be prepared to teach students these particular skills, but also to be knowledgeable of this, this standard and this information as well. And so there's this dual nature with the EPP literacy standards and an expectation that candidates have this knowledge and that they're prepared to support students in this particular learning. Another way to navigate these literacy standards, if you are less familiar with them, is they are organized in a more linear format. So as you notice, Standard 1 is all about content. Standard 2, as you navigate through them, is all about our literacy, language and literacy-rich environment, and then curriculum and instruction, professional learning, and assessment and evaluation. And they're purposefully organized in that way so that EPPs understand what the requirements are within these subheadings. However, what you'll notice throughout the review process is that EPPs will integrate these standards in ways where content 1 will be paired with, or content standard number 1 may be paired with content standards from section 3 with curriculum and instruction. And again, that's what we are hoping to see. We are hoping that there is an integration of these standards across the program in very meaningful ways. A final point about the EPP literacy standards, as you become more familiar with them, is that there can be multiple expectations per standard. And I can give you an example of what that might look like. If you refer to standard 3.9 within the EPP literacy standards, you'll see that standard reads, analyze text, that educator candidates will analyze text for complexity, quality, and alignment to instructional goals and student readiness. And then there's a semicolon and it says that they'll select a wide range of appropriately complex text. And what's important to note about these standards that have multiple expectations is that, well, number one, EPPs will need to address each standard in its entirety, but also you can see the requirements in what EPPs will need to do in order to teach those standards. So in my mind, if I was preparing a candidate, it may make sense to have candidates engage in that analysis of those texts before they're ready to make the selections of those complex texts for instruction. And this will be very important as we talk more about our comprehensive questions within the proposal template, because what we're really aiming to do is to see how programs are building coherence, and that programs are going to be paying attention to that candidate development, which is essential when thinking about literacy preparation. I will give everyone just a few minutes to scan through our literacy standards on pages 21 through 37, and I want you to find specific examples where you see multiple expectations per standard and make a notation next to those standards. Let's spend just a few minutes finding some of those examples. Okay, hopefully you had a moment to look through those standards and find some of those standards that require multiple expectations. You may notice that the majority of those multiple expectations fall within standards 2, 3, 4, and 5. I'm going to pause here. We got a good question via chat about the adopted versus revised language on the standards. I'm going to turn that over to Amy to respond to.
So you might notice at the bottom of the standards that your document that you're looking at that there's an adopted date of October 31st, 2014, as well as the revised date of January 26, 2018. That 2014 adopted date reflects a date when we had an overhaul of the entire educator preparation policy. I'm not exactly sure what Annie sent to you, but I suspect that it was an excerpted part of that policy that was just focused on the literacy standards. The broader policy identifies how we approve and review all of our educator preparation program that extends well beyond just our work on literacy. And the revised date is the last date that the state board met, and actually at that board meeting they were reviewing and approving some minor changes to our literacy standards. So I hope that provides the clarity that you need. I'll add one additional note though. These standards have been a part of this policy for, and I'm looking at Martin, but I think they've been, I think it was October 2016 when they were added to the policy on final reading. And since then we have made some minor revisions, but they've been in this policy for quite a while.
Thank you, Amy. I think that there's an important distinction to make, too. For those EPP reviewers who have engaged in our November convenings, you all were using a slightly different version of these standards that were revised, I believe, back in July. And so there, as Amy mentioned, there are very minor changes to the literacy standards that you see before you today, and it's mostly just the cleaning up of language and formatting. Okay, so for our LEA reviewers in particular, I wanted to spend a moment and talk about how familiar our EPPs are becoming with teaching literacy in Tennessee in particular. My role actually started in August of 2017, and one of the first tasks I was charged with was to engage our EPPs in a series of 3 convenings that took place during November. So we held a West Tennessee convening, a Middle, and an East Tennessee convening throughout the first 2 weeks of November. These were 2-day convenings, and we engaged our EPPs in essentially a training of teaching literacy in Tennessee to help them get familiar with what this document looked like. But in addition, we had our Read to Be Ready team spend a lot of time discussing the Read to Be Ready resources in a way to really support EPPs in a larger understanding of this teaching literacy in Tennessee state approach that goes beyond just the document itself. EPPs were able to also spend some time within their teams and start setting some goals in terms of thinking about the new literacy standards and teaching literacy in Tennessee and what potential changes they might need to make to their early elementary and special education programs. And so at these November convenings, they were able to identify particular areas of their programs they would like to revise, which really got them starting to think about the requirements leading towards this proposal review. After November, we were able to convene our EPPs with our first Literacy Network meeting. And literacy leads from each EPP across the state convened in January and spent some time talking first about high-quality curriculum and how that can provide coherence when using high-quality curriculum from pre-service to in-service. But then we had the opportunity to spend some time talking about the content related to the proposal. And so this was an opportunity, again, for EPPs to continue thinking about the changes they were making in their programs and to talk again with their teams and with the department and make some more progress on these proposals in relation to the content. We will host our second EPP Literacy Network meeting on March 7th, where we anticipate engaging in more of this specific work time to support these EPPs as they're developing the content for their proposals. Finally, there's been lots of ongoing technical support in the form of phone calls and emails from various EPPs, depending on where they are in developing their proposals, with me and other members of our team to ensure that they are fulfilling the requirements and thinking deeply about the standards in teaching literacy in Tennessee. And we anticipate this technical support continuing throughout until the proposals are due, and then again after, as they are thinking about the implementation of these programs in the fall. Okay, so this was what we hope to share with you with that was just an overview of where EPPs are, what their understanding of teaching literacy in Tennessee, and to provide for you a broad overview of the standards. And now we want to get into some of these specifics. So if you have a copy of the literacy proposal template, which I have sent to you via email, if you could have that accessible in front of you as we walk through this, there are a few things that we want to make sure that we touch upon that would be helpful for you to have that copy in front of you. For EPPs who are very knowledgeable of this proposal template, we wanted to point out that there are very minor adjustments to the copy that we sent to you about a few days ago via email. And what we did here, based on the feedback that we received from the EPP Literacy Network, there were a couple changes that we wanted to make to either increase the word count limit on the comprehensive questions, and also to provide a bit more information regarding the attachments that are allowed to support the proposal process writing. And so what you'll notice is there are the very minor changes that we made to this template are all indicated on red. So for our EPPs, please take note of those changes. These will be articulated in this week's EPP update, which will be going out tomorrow. So if you have that proposal template in front of you, we want to spend a bit of time talking about not only the structure of this, but what we anticipate seeing as EPPs are submitting their proposals. And one of the things we wanted to point out right away is that we asked EPPs to be really thoughtful about how they want to integrate or to streamline their programs within this proposal submission. What you'll notice on the template in front of you, on the third paragraph within the introduction, is that we wrote that EPPs are encouraged to streamline the proposal process and submit a single proposal that addresses multiple programs in ways that make sense. And an example that was given is that the early and elementary programs, if they have more overlaps than distinctions in relation to the literacy preparation for their candidates, then it would make sense to submit one proposal that would have both, that would cover both the early and elementary literacy requirements. Now, this gets a bit tricky because all EPPs have a varied amount of programs within these endorsement areas. And so what we wanted to do here on the slide in front of you is show you how these endorsements are broken down within the early, elementary, and special education areas. So early could consist of a pre-K to K program, as well as a special education early childhood pre-K to 3 program, and would also incorporate early childhood pre-K to 3. So saying early childhood is can actually mean multiple endorsements within that area. Elementary education is our K-5 grade range, and special education endorsement for this proposal includes our interventionist K-8, and then interventionist for 6-12, as well as our comprehensive programs for K-12. And so what we've asked for our EPPs to do is to streamline these proposal processes and submit that proposal that would make sense. The best advice I've been giving to EPPs as they continue to ask about this is to think about, as you're drafting a proposal, then if there are more overlaps in terms of that preparation than distinctions, it more than likely makes sense to submit one proposal for those programs.
Amy, this is Amy, everyone. I'd like to also add that there are other possible distinctions that you'll see. So providers may also have differences across programs, for example, that are undergraduate versus post-baccalaureate. And so it's possible that, oh, Annie's got it on her next slide. I was jumping the gun here a little bit, but So it's possible that you would see two proposals, for example, for elementary K-5. It would be possible that the undergraduate program would look somewhat different than the post-baccalaureate program, and so we might get two proposals from one EPP. In addition, in post-baccalaureate instances, there are different kinds of clinical experiences that you might see. Here you'll note that we have job embedded as a clinical practice pathway. Those are our candidates who are currently teaching while they are enrolled in preparation. And so you can imagine that structurally a program might find that it's so different from their undergraduate elementary program that they would prefer to submit two proposals. So just want to alert you to the fact that you could see not only multiple proposals for the various endorsement areas, but you could also see a single endorsement area having multiple proposals. But again, we've tried to encourage providers where they can to collapse those proposals together. And so sometimes what you'll be seeing, and I think Annie might talk about a bit more, is that they'll note those distinctions within a single proposal, and that's appropriate. And again, we're trying to provide lots of guidance as our ed prep providers are making their choices related to this. And in fact, we've been asking our providers to give us an idea of how they are organizing this ahead of time. And we do see that there's a good amount of collapsing across different programs, which means, you know, we don't end up with 600 proposals, but it's a manageable number.
Mm-hmm. And to think about this really practically, what we'll have on our form that EPPs will complete as they're submitting their proposals is we'll require them to take from a drop-down menu each one of the programs with the level and the clinical practice pathway to indicate this proposal is addressing these specific programs with these particular pathways, so that you, as a reviewer, will receive this information and know right away, oh, okay, they're combining early childhood and elementary. So my job is to ensure that whenever there are any distinctions made between those two programs, that I'm noting those, that I'm ensuring that the EPP has noted those distinctions within their proposal as applicable. And so we'll, during our next training, give you a very concrete example of what this will look like, and as Amy talked about, giving you some more examples of what types of distinctions we might see within those examples. Okay, so let's continue our discussion about this proposal template. What you'll notice if you have that proposal template in front of you, on the bottom of page 1, you'll see part 1, which articulates the standards alignment requirements. And this is broken down into A, B, C, and D. And what this is referring to is on the second page of the proposal document, you'll see essentially a table. We've been calling this a matrix table. And I'm going to walk you through what this table will look like and what you can expect to see. One thing I want to mention before we get started is that reviewers, you all, will not be responsible for evaluating this particular matrix table. What you will have is this piece of the, this component of the proposal in front of you as you are evaluating the comprehensive questions. And what this table does is it essentially shows you a map of the program. And it can show how what EPPs will be required to do is on the left-hand column where it says name of literacy course or module or name of non-literacy specific course or module, is EPPs will replace that language and input the name of their course. So it might read something like EDUC 486. And in the next column over where it says course module or timing, what EPPs will indicate there is when their candidates most frequently take that course. So for example, it may be junior year, fall semester, maybe one example of course module timing. As you continue over, EPPs will be given a drop-down menu to indicate all of the EPP literacy standards that will be covered within that particular literacy course or module. And then finally, in the column over to the right where it says candidate assessments, EPPs will have the opportunity to write in any of the major assessments that are given to candidates during that literacy course or module that is specifically measuring or assessing those EPP literacy standards. There may be a question about why we put the name of a non-literacy specific course on this table. And the answer to that is as you become more familiar with these EPP literacy standards, you'll notice that they don't necessarily belong just in literacy methods or content courses. You can see, and we're encouraging EPPs to think about these literacy standards across their entire program. So if EPPs are seeing that some of these standards are fitting really well into, say, a social studies methods course, then they will be indicating this particular, what we're calling a non-literacy specific course on the table and show which specific literacy standards will be covered within there. And again, what this is doing is really hopefully supporting this program coherence, which we'll talk about more when we get to the first question. I'm going to pause here just for a moment and give everyone an opportunity to just chat in their box if there are any particular questions. I did receive one from Jennifer. In the literacy standards column, do we put 1 or 1.1, 1.2, et cetera? It's a great question. EPPs will be required to put down to the indicator level within that category. And again, the way that we'll format this is that you'll select those particular standards from a drop-down menu. And so that means that you'll either select like a 1.2 or a 4.3 or a 3.6. So you will need to, EPPs will need to go down to that indicator level. The exception is when you look at content standard number 1, and you can see beginning on page 21 that these standards are 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, et cetera, but there are bullets underneath those, and we are not asking EPPs to break it down to that sub-indicator level. They will just need to indicate 1.2, 1.3, et cetera. Okay, another question here. If EPPs list a non-literacy course, do they have to provide assessments for these courses also? And the answer to that is if the assessments are assessing the literacy standards, then the answer is yes. Is that helpful? Great. Okay. If there are any other questions regarding this matrix table, please let me know, and we'll be able to address those as they come in. Let's transition to talk a bit about proposal part 2, which is the comprehensive questions. Okay, so proposal part 2 regarding the comprehensive questions is really the meat of the proposal, and this is where we're going to need support from reviewers to do a deep evaluation using the literacy rubric. And so what we'd like for you to do is to have the proposal template in front of you, either electronically or hard copy, and then to also pull the literacy rubric that I sent out yesterday in front of you as well. And what you'll notice on the PowerPoint is we're going to go through each one of these in particular and outline this criteria. And so that everybody is very clear about what this criteria says, how it is going to be used to measure the question itself, And so if you have any particular questions, we'll make sure to pause after each one of these questions before moving on so that everyone is clear. Okay. As you're looking at the literacy rubric for early elementary special education program proposals, this is the horizontal document. You'll see that every section of this rubric follows the same format. And what's listed at the top is the question in which the rubric aligns to, and whether or not optional or required evidence will be included. And then each one of these areas of the rubric are broken down into either meets, approaching, or below expectations. For the purposes of today, we're only going to focus on our meets expectations criteria. And when we get to our in-person reviewer training, we'll be able to talk more about approaching and below so that everyone has a firm understanding of how the evidence collected by the reviewers will match up with the criteria in one of these three areas. So we will talk more about the approaching and below at a later date. I'm going to pause here too because I think we got another question. All right, we received a question back regarding the matrix table, and the question was, how are you ensuring that Content 1 standard, 1.1, 1.1.1, 1.2.1, et cetera, are being met? And there's a good point here that the bullet points are quite specific, where the standard itself is really rather general. And what we're encouraging EPPs to do is within their planning is to think about those standards down to the sub-indicator level within their planning. But for the sake of reviewing, we find that if we are requiring all of the standards to be broken down to that sub-indicator level, the process for reviewing can become a bit unwieldy. So again, we want to encourage EPPs to think about planning down to that sub-indicator level, but for the purposes of this review, we're only requiring it down to the indicator level.
And I would add one other thing. You know, alignment to standards is only one significant part of the process, but what we're also doing in Tennessee is thinking a lot about outcomes. And so we now have a series of annual reports that we provide to all of our educator preparation providers that give them detailed information about the performance of their candidates. And so, you know, while the alignment and the proposal process is critically important, we also have the back end review with accountability, and so providers will be thinking about how their candidates are doing in the field, and what we hope they do is use these standards as guidelines, and they may elect, and I know that some in fact have already aligned all of their coursework down to the sub-indicator level, but in terms of managing a process for review, looking at the indicator level seems to be both the most manageable and appropriate for this process.
Thanks, Amy. We had another question, too, about optional evidence. I'm going to go back here. On this slide, again, there's only one comprehensive question that requires evidence, and that's question number 3. For all other questions, questions 1, 2, 4, and 5, EPPs are given the option of including optional evidence to support their narrative responses. And so within this optional evidence, though, we want to make this task of reviewing still feasible for reviewers. And so we wanted to provide some guidance for EPPs as they're submitting this evidence to not go too far and submit like a 20-page attachment, because that could make the review process really quite unwieldy. And so we did provide guidelines for each one, and you can see those guidelines on the proposal template. And so what we're going to encourage, and I think we need to continue to communicate this to all of our EPPs, but as you're thinking, as EPPs are thinking about the evidence that they want to submit that's optional, they want to get very specific about what they're actually submitting. So in other words, if an entire syllabus wants to be submitted, and we know sometimes syllabi can get very long, very lengthy, we're going to encourage EPPs to just submit sections of the syllabus that support the narrative responses to the answers. And the other thing that we'll encourage our EPPs to do is if one particular syllabus is submitted for optional evidence, it can be used for other optional evidence to answer other questions. So for example, if a syllabus was submitted for question 1, then we will encourage our EPPs to say, you know, please refer to the evidence submitted for question 1. So I'm hoping that that helps with that answer. Okay, so the rubric criteria within these proposals is really essential for you all to understand very deeply. And so really one of your big tasks between now and March, when we do our next in-person training, is to understand this criteria very, very well. What you'll notice in, if you're looking at the electronic version of this rubric, is that as you sort of glance through the entire document, you'll see that there are specific words and phrases that are highlighted with links to resources. So we got some really great feedback at our Literacy Network meeting from EPP folks that said, you know, when you say the term complex text, for example, you know, what do you really mean when you say that? And so as again, the purpose of this review is to not only think about the literacy standards, but also teaching literacy in Tennessee, we wanted to provide guidance in the form of resources right there in that rubric, so that as EPPs are thinking about this criteria, that they can click on those resources and understand how teaching literacy in Tennessee defines these particular terms. Now, I want to be careful here because we don't necessarily want to prescribe a definition of a term, but we do want to provide guidance so that EPPs have an understanding of what this criteria is. So again, there's this balance that we at the department need to ensure that we can, you know, provide those resources, but not be too overly prescriptive. So, so one of your tasks, and again, you are all chosen purposely because of your depth of knowledge of teaching literacy in Tennessee, is to make sure you're familiarizing yourself with all of those links and footnotes that reference resources within this criteria. We also encourage you to study this rubric language very carefully and to understand where there are changes. For example, when it says that responses may include but is not limited to, and to really think about what that could mean. And we'll, again, talk about that more practically using examples at our next training. EPPs have received a draft of this rubric, and they will receive the final draft on Friday in the EPP update. So they are very well aware of what this criteria is, and hopefully they're using it to help formulate their responses to these comprehensive questions. I'm going to pause here and just make sure that to address any questions that we have regarding rubric criteria overall. Okay, we're not receiving any questions, so I'll move on, but again, feel free to submit any questions at any time. So the way that I would like to take us through the rubric criteria is to read the question and understand the question on the proposal template well, and then to look at the criteria that will be used to measure that, and really just walk through each of these areas so that we are all on the same page about the meaning of the ask of the question as well as the meaning of the criteria used to evaluate. So our first question requires EPPs to think about program sequence. And they are asked to describe how the literacy program sequence demonstrates coherence and increases in complexity and depth over time. And on your proposal template, you'll notice that this question references specific research that does support the idea that high-quality programs can demonstrate complexity and depth over time. And so what we are, I'm going to come back to that italicized comment in just a moment, but what we're looking for in terms of this for EPPs to demonstrate this coherence and complexity built over time is indicated in these bullet points. I'm going to jump down to that first bullet point where it says, concepts related to standards are introduced, reinforced, assessed, and integrated within practice as the program grows in complexity. So you'll receive proposals that will ask EPPs to have a narrative response that's limited to 1,500 words. So this is one of the more larger responses, because really what we're after here is that the EPPs are thinking about their literacy preparation as a whole. And when this first bullet point asks for standards to be introduced, reinforced, and assessed, and then integrated within practice, makes me think about, again, how those standards are created. When we reference that example about standards 3.9, where you notice that candidates were asked to analyze complex text and then be able to select those texts for instruction, you can see that if a program is really thinking about this and wanting to build complexity over time within their program, then they can think about introducing candidates to, this is what it means to analyze a text for complexity. What is text complexity? And they'll think about that logically first before they're required to select those texts for instruction. And so examples like that may be present within their narrative responses that will show that this is an appropriate program that is thinking about the candidates as they come in with less experience and less knowledge in literacy, and as they continue through that program is built in complexity to support them as they graduate and become in-service teachers themselves. So that's essentially what we're looking for when we're using that language of coherence and complexity. EPPs may also decide to talk about their program objectives, specifically objectives within their courses. And what the second bullet talks about is what proximal level that candidates might be able to attain through the guidance of the instructor. And when we think about that word proximal, it's very similar to what we all know as the zone of proximal development. And as we think about that, programs that are coherent and building complexity think about what candidates can do on their own and what they need to achieve by the end of their program, and then really that middle ground too of what they can do with the guidance of a more capable other. And so what we're aiming to see is that these candidates are supported throughout the duration of their literacy program. And then finally, the third bullet, candidates are provided opportunities to build deep literacy content knowledge while applying this knowledge in practice. And we got a great question at the Literacy Network meeting regarding this bullet. And what this does not necessarily, what this does not imply is that we're requiring EPPs to revamp their programs to ensure that there's a clinical experience with every single literacy course. That's clearly not what we are asking to do. But what we are asking EPPs to do is to remain mindful of thinking about how candidates are building their literacy content knowledge and being able to make those connections while they're practicing. And so what this might mean is that there could be a clinical experience that is taken concurrently with a literacy methods course. But what it could also mean is that candidates are being supported in thinking about very deliberately asking, like, do you remember what we learned in this course? This is why that's practical now as you're thinking about your clinical experience and working with students. And so we want EPPs to be very deliberate about thinking about that marriage of content knowledge with practice. I'm going to pause here for a moment and just see if there are any questions about this rubric criteria on slide 30. Okay, we received a question about whether or not student teaching should be included. I think absolutely yes, if there's an opportunity for candidates to be practicing their literacy knowledge with that student teaching, even if they're not necessarily taking courses during that time, then I think it should be included on there. I'm going to hop back to this italicized language that's indicated on the proposal template. And what we've written here is it says, if program sequence varies across cohorts, provide a rationale for how candidates will be provided opportunities to deepen their understanding of literacy knowledge and application. And what this means is that we have EPPs that are very large and run multiple cohorts of students that are receiving instruction at the same time. And so there are times where there may not be a more sequenced, of courses necessarily that states that candidates will take this course during fall of junior year and then this course during fall of spring year, where that may be an option for them to go through that sequence, but they may have an option to take a course during one semester or another semester, and that's fine. Again, we don't want to prescribe a particular sequence of courses that EPPs need to take in a particular order, but what this italicized language says is that if it does vary, if it's not a lockstep sequence, that the EPPs are still providing a rationale for how these candidates are going to be deepening their knowledge in complex ways throughout the course of the program. And what you'll notice here in terms of the review is at the bottom of this rubric there's a checkbox, and we'll talk more about that, but EPPs will be required to provide that rationale, and in terms of the evaluation of this, we'll talk more about that in our training in March. Okay, let's transition to question 2. clinical experiences. And one thing I wanted to note here is you are going to see overlap. Again, if an EPP is being really thoughtful about building coherence across their literacy preparation program, you're going to see overlaps likely from question 1 to question 2 to question 3. And that's fine. We want to encourage our EPPs to be very deliberate in their responses, but there may be clinical experiences addressed in question 1, but question 2 is thinking very specifically about clinical experiences in particular. So the question here that's raised for our EPPs to respond to is describe how the clinical experiences are designed to build on each other in ways that support candidate developmental understanding of teaching literacy. And again, what this, the criteria for this in particular, we've outlined under the meets expectation language, is that clinical experiences are being mindful of this gradual release of responsibility. So in other words, what we know from research is that we wouldn't necessarily ask a candidate right off the bat to just jump in and start teaching a whole class lesson if they haven't necessarily had the opportunity to analyze a lesson or observe a lesson. So what you can note here with this criteria is that the bullets underneath, such as observe classroom instruction and engage in co-planning and co-teaching, essentially follow a gradual release of responsibility model. And so again, how we're defining clinical experiences here is not just student teaching, but it's any time that candidates have an opportunity to practice in the field. So any early field experiences or student teaching or observation time would be counted within this clinical experiences definition. I'm going to pause here and take any questions that we have about this.
So we've gotten a good question about the selection of the clinical mentor or the cooperating teacher that is working with candidates and who gets to make that selection. And I think that's a great question. Currently, we know that a lot of our EPPs communicate with districts about the characteristics of the candidates, of the cooperating teachers that they would like to have their candidates placed with, but it's not always the case that the EPP has any direct input on this, and sometimes they receive lists from districts of individuals who are available and willing to serve as clinical mentors. If there's another question about that, then please feel free to forward it, but it isn't we shouldn't set as an expectation that the EPP has autonomy over who those cooperating educators are.
Okay, if there are any other questions about clinical experiences here, I'm happy to answer them. One other thing I wanted to note about this question is for EPPs that were familiar with our template, our proposal template before, we added just a little bit of different language here that says, if not adequately described in responses to question 3, explain how the program ensures implementation standards are addressed. And what I wanted to do here was call your attention to the literacy standards again. And not only are there literacy standards that we've already articulated in terms of EPP literacy standards 1 through 5, there are also program implementation standards. There's actually only one for early and elementary candidates, and this can be found right on page 33. And if EPPs are adequately addressing within their narrative responses and meeting the criteria as listed in Rubric 2 or Part 2 of the rubric, they will more than likely, as you can see reading through this implementation, cover this implementation standard. The one I really want to call attention to is that special education has a different set of implementation standards, and these can be found on the next page, page 34. There are implementation standards for interventionist programs, and there are there are implementation standards for the comprehensive programs as well. And more than likely, the EPPs will be addressing these implementation standards within their responses, and we will talk about what this will look like at our next training. But if for some reason they are not adequately addressing these standards within their question 2, or within their question 3, then they'll need to call out specifically special education. All programs will need to call out specifically what these, how they'll be addressing these implementation standards. So just wanted to call your attention to these standards, as they may not have been considered as we were walking through the others. All right, let's move on to question 3, and this is, there's a bit of a difference here for EPPs that have been familiar with the previous rubric, and I want to call attention to this. Question 3 is the same question regardless of whether there's an early elementary or special education program within the EPP, but there is now a separate section of the rubric for special education programs to address candidate assessments. And so we'll walk through each part of this question 3, as it is probably the most comprehensive question that we're going to be asking on this proposal. And so question 3 begins, and EPPs have an opportunity to submit a narrative response of 1,000 words to talk specifically about 2 to 4 candidate assessments and describe how these assessments are aligned with teaching literacy in Tennessee. And there are 4 parts to this question that are required for EPPs to respond to. And so this first part asks, and we're calling this part 3A, is that responses must include how candidates will demonstrate the ability to engage in deep literacy content knowledge with complex text. And for early and elementary programs, you'll see the criteria listed under 3A on your literacy rubric. And we started off this response by stating that EPPs must exclude the EdTPA and praxis assessment. Now, I want to be clear here. Many of you may know that the EdTPA is a performance assessment that will be mandated by all EPPs beginning January of 2019. When we say EdTPA in this context, we're talking about the official submitted EdTPA, which we are excluding from this particular rubric. Now, that's not to say that EPPs often prepare candidates for the official EdTPA. So the preparation of the preparation used to support candidates for the EdTPA can still be considered an assessment for this for response to this question. So I wanted to make sure that that was clear. We are excluding the official submitted EdTPA. So what candidates will be doing here is thinking about that this assessment will require candidates to engage in deep literacy content with appropriately complex text. And so EPPs will be submitting an assessment and a narrative response describing this assessment that will show evidence of, that might include but not limited to, how candidates will articulate how skills-based and knowledge-based competencies work together to make text, make meaning from text, engage with multiple complex texts to understand the considerations of high-quality literature, and assess the qualitative features of text complexity. And so when I read this question and think about this deeply, this is really thinking specifically about the candidates. How is this assessment going to ensure that they have deep literacy content knowledge? And how are they thinking about this in regards to appropriately complex text? You'll notice that there are several links within this rubric that point to guidance for these particular terms or phrases. And if you've had a chance to look at these resources already, you'll notice many of them are directly from our Read to Be Ready resources. So as we think about, I'm going to transition us to think about Rubric 3A for special education programs. So again, this is a bit of a change. Special education programs still have to address this question about how they will know that candidates will deeply engage in literacy content knowledge with appropriately complex text. But based on the feedback that we received from the Literacy Network meeting, we recognize the importance of the preparation of SPED candidates in literacy as being more unique. And so we collaborated with both our department stakeholders and external stakeholders to think very critically about this criteria that will be used specifically for special education programs. And what you'll see on slide 36 is that that the language indicated in red is the changes that we made from the language that will be used to assess the early and elementary assessments. And so the distinction that you'll see on this slide, beginning with that first bullet, is that candidates are still required to articulate how skills-based and knowledge-based competencies will be used to make meaning from text, and also how the adaptations and modifications using these evidence-based intervention practices can support meaning making. So you can see, again, we know that special education teachers generally collaborate a lot with the general education teachers to create lessons and to think about their students in that regard. So we're calling out specifically that special education needs to think carefully about those adaptations and modifications. Okay, as we look at the second bullet, engage with developmentally appropriate complex text, in our final iteration of this rubric, we actually eliminated that word developmentally. It is not in your rubric, and that is intentionally. So please ignore that word developmentally. That should not be listed on that bullet. Otherwise, that bullet is used very similarly to assess special education candidates in thinking about appropriately complex text in regards to that high-quality literature. The third bullet also remains the same, and then the fourth bullet is that we're looking for assessments that will demonstrate, that will require candidates to demonstrate proficiency in various modes of communication, both expressive and receptive. So I'll pause here and see if there are any particular questions about 3A, either the question or the criteria for early elementary or special education. Okay, we got a question that reads, will the text in red apply to pre-K3 SPED? And the answer is yes. This language in red will apply for the special education programs, including pre-K3. Okay, I'm going to transition us to question 3B and accompanying criteria. And what this question asks is that, again, candidates, we're thinking about candidate assessments, and that these particular assessments submitted to answer this question and the responses will include how candidates will demonstrate the ability to select complex text for instruction. So again, with 3A, we're really interested in how candidates are developing this literacy knowledge, specifically about complex text. Now we're thinking about how candidates will be using that knowledge to select complex text for instruction. So with Rubric 3B for early and elementary programs, the criteria lists that the submitted assessments requires candidates to select the complex text for instruction, and some evidence may include, but is not limited to, how candidates will analyze multiple texts for quantitative, qualitative, reader, and task factors. And I'm going to pause there for a moment again and refer you to the resource that we provided for complex text on the earlier rubric, because if there's any question about what we mean in talking about complex text, this resource will really flesh out these particular factors that are used for the analysis process. So that resource will be very valuable to review if you haven't done so already. Other evidence that might be included are rationales for selecting text that consider text complexity factors and content knowledge requirements articulated in the Tennessee ELA academic standards. Candidates might, within this assessment, might also be asked to pair appropriately complex text with a variety of high-quality instructional strategies. These instructional strategies reference the elements of the literacy block. And if you click on that link, it'll take you right to the TWIT document that articulates strategies such as the interactive read aloud, shared reading, interactive writing, etc. And then finally, this assessment may also show how candidates will analyze or develop purposefully sequenced text sets. So again, all of this is really around how candidates are being prepared and assessed on their ability to select complex text for instruction. So as we transition to Rubric 3B for SPED, we again want to think about what candidates who are preparing to be special education teachers are required to do. And again, they want to think very critically about the materials and the access of these materials for their students. And so evidence for this assessment, again, they're being asked the same question, but we're looking specifically for how candidates will consider the various ways that students access the text and materials. We're thinking about how candidates will be assessed on how they consider students' communication strengths or deficits and provide rationales for why specific text materials and equipment are appropriate for instruction. They might also be asked to demonstrate the multiple ways to design instruction for students with complex needs and to develop and match literacy learning experiences and evidence-based practices to individual learning characteristics of children. So again, it's the same ask, but it's through this lens of special education and thinking about how we can best prepare those SPED candidates in the ways that they can be supporting their students. I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions about 3B. Okay, I haven't received any questions about 3B. So if those come to you at a later time, feel free to ask them during the duration of this webinar or afterwards on our Google Doc. At this point, we're going to take a 10-minute break, and what we're requesting that you do is log in, don't touch anything on your computers, keep your audio on, keep your computers on. We just think that will alleviate any potential problems. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Thanks for sticking with us. We know that this is a lot of information to take in, but we think it's really important to do this broad overview of the template and the criteria so that when we meet for our in-person training, we'll have the opportunity to really engage deeply with the examples and not spend so much time on the language and understanding that language. So thanks for bearing with us. Excuse me, we did receive a question. It says, when we refer to special education, are we referring to both co-teaching and inclusion?
Well, in this instance, what matters is what endorsement the candidate is being prepared for, not whether they will end up in a co-teaching environment or not. So recall that this is about preparation, and employment is a separate matter. Of course, someone who ends up with a SPED pre-K3 endorsement may end up in a classroom where they are working with a teacher who is a general education teacher, but the expectation would be that because they have this endorsement that they have that special education background.
Thanks, Amy. Okay, let's continue our discussion about question 3, and we're on 3C. So again, our candidates, our EPPs are submitting responses that will show how they are engaging candidates in assessments. And we are moving on to 3C, where it's asking for responses to include how candidates will demonstrate the ability to use complex text to support students' vocabulary and knowledge acquisition. So for early and elementary programs, they will consider these assessments that may provide evidence but is not limited to the following bullet points here. The first including identifying the general academic and disciplinary specific words and phrases necessary for students' comprehension and communication about complex text, how students may be interpreting these words and phrases as they're used in text, using repeated interactive read-alouds to build students' knowledge of Tier 2 and Tier 3 vocabulary, provide implicit, embedded, and explicit vocabulary instruction rather than teaching from vocabulary from isolated lists, and design lessons that include opportunities for students to build vocabulary through purposeful question sequences. And again, I just wanted to point out this language of the assessment might include but is not limited to. And so, and again, we'll get into the specifics of the how within our next training, but these are just examples of types of evidence that we may see that will support this idea of candidates using complex text to support students' vocabulary and knowledge acquisition. There may be other instances or evidence provided by the EPP that's not on this list of criteria that would still be considered evidence to support this response. So please keep that in mind. So the rubrics for our special education programs for this particular question is similar to the language for early and elementary, with a few exceptions indicated in red. The second bullet states is that candidates will support students in interpreting words and phrases as they're used in text by incorporating visuals and models throughout instruction. So we're calling that out in particular for our special education teachers to think about this use of visuals to support understanding depending on their students' needs. Also, the use of repeated interactive read-alouds to provide implicit, embedded, and explicit vocabulary instruction. And again, with this last bullet, design or co-design lessons, because we do know that candidates, special education candidates, are not always solely responsible for designing lessons, literacy lessons, but maybe doing so in collaboration with another teacher or instructor. So that language shift is subtle, but it's important to note. I'll pause here for a moment and just see if there are any questions in regards to 3C. Okay, no questions so far. I'll transition to 3D. This rounds out our requirements for candidate assessments, in that we're asking for EPPs to show in their responses that their candidate assessments show how candidates will demonstrate the ability to create daily and end-of-unit tasks. And again, as you're familiar with teaching literacy in Tennessee, this language should be very familiar for you. And again, if not, or if you need additional clarification, that embedded link there will take you right to a Read to Be Ready resource. So for early and elementary, we're providing this criteria that will show how the evidence collected from this assessment might include how students engage in end-of-unit tasks that allow students opportunities to synthesize what they've read and heard and seen during instruction in an authentic and meaningful way, and demonstrate that critical thinking and textual analysis skills, and to convey that conceptual knowledge. And then also, so we have the ask of the end-of-unit task language, and as well as the daily tasks. And so the daily tasks, the candidate assessments might show evidence that candidates are engaged in tasks for students that will incrementally show their knowledge and skills until they're able to fully demonstrate their learning through more comprehensive end-of-unit tasks. We got a good question with our Literacy Network meeting a few weeks ago about the order of this criteria, and it is intentional. As you know, with teaching literacy in Tennessee, we always keep the end in mind. So as we're thinking about that more comprehensive end-of-unit task that we want our students to engage in, we want to be thinking about how we're supporting our candidates to be thinking in the same regard, and then supporting them on that regular basis of devising those tasks for students that will culminate into that learning that will be demonstrated in the end-of-unit task. So again, it's the planning of having the end in mind in regards to this criteria. So for special education, the language is pretty similar to the early and elementary. However, we added the language in red down below where we may see evidence within these assessments where candidates are collaborating with their general education teachers to ensure that tasks are aligned with students' IEP or IFSP goals. And that would be the individualized education plans or individualized family plans. So again, just keeping in mind that lens of special education in terms of thinking about literacy preparation for our candidates. So I'll pause here and give anyone a chance to either ask a question about 3D or about question 3 as a whole. I can take any of those questions that you may have. Okay, no questions so far, but again, if there are any that you think of along the way, please let us know. Question 3 is a heavy lift, and we recognize that there's going to be probably a lot of questions in this regard with candidate assessments. At least that's been the case so far as we've been engaging with our EPPs. So we want to, we'll spend some substantial amount of time at our next training looking at evidence in terms of responses for this question in particular. So we received a question just now. Will candidates be experiencing universal screening, progress monitoring, assessing, study of the data, and how to form instruction? And likely the answer is yes. And we see that in literacy preparation, that's definitely something that we're hoping our candidates are being supported in to understand specific literacy assessments. Now, in terms of this proposal process, we're not calling these out in particular. However, the candidate assessments that they may submit may be examples of or may be using those particular assessments that were just mentioned.
I'll just remind everyone that, and I know our ed prep folks are probably very keenly aware of this, but especially for our district folks, all of our programs are aligned to the NTASC standards, which are professional education standards, as well as specialty area standards that are related to the content of their programs. So there are lots of aspects of their programs that are not addressed through the literacy standards, and while we understand that sometimes there is overlap and we'll expect to see some of those things appear in these proposals, remember that these proposals are not addressing the full scope of the entire endorsement program. And if you have additional questions about that or things that you're concerned about not seeing, we'll be happy to talk with you either individually or more when we do the in-person training.
Thanks, Amy. Okay, we just received another question. Will we have exemplars to view for these comprehensive questions? And the answer is yes. We'll walk through some, not necessarily exemplars, but examples of responses that we'll be using for you all to train how to look at those example responses with the rubric criteria to determine whether or not an EPP will be meeting, approaching, or below expectations in that regard. Okay, I'm going to transition us to question 4 about student difference. On your proposal template, the fourth question is, as it relates to literacy, how will the EPP provide opportunities for candidates to demonstrate and apply knowledge of student difference, including but not limited to cultural, linguistic, and ability as a source of strength in society to be encouraged and not discouraged? You may note that this language is familiar because this is, the latter half of this question is actually language directly from the EPP literacy standards. So this is something that we think is very important that EPPs are considering that within their literacy preparation program. And the ask of this question is for EPPs to describe 2 to 3 examples of evidence that will be collected from the candidates to demonstrate these outcomes. So again, we're transitioning back to rubric 4 will be inclusive of all programs. So we're no longer separating early and elementary from special education. So all programs will respond to this question and have the same rubric criteria. The criteria here is that underneath the expectation language is that the EPP can provide evidence of at least 2 opportunities. And the way that we have phrased the bullets underneath is that when you're evaluating these responses, they must include providing opportunities for candidates that will A, position students as knowledgeable and valuable contributors of information, regardless of speaking or writing proficiency, and B, encourage differentiated literacy instruction to meet students' varied needs. In other words, in order to meet the meets expectations language here, these must be identified in relation to an opportunity provided for candidates. We have language below that states strong responses would also include providing opportunities for candidates to challenge deficit thinking, support a development of cultural knowledge, self-awareness, et cetera, and to promote student differences assets and use these contributions to enhance student learning. And so what this means is that the responses from programs who are considering not only how they're going to position students as knowledgeable and valuable contributors of information and to differentiate literacy instruction, but that they're going to take it a step beyond and think about how these opportunities will be provided for candidates to not just address needs, but to take it beyond and think about student differences assets and how this can contribute to the classroom. And so what you'll see, and we'll get into with the approaching and below language, where responses might differ, and we'll go over those examples to show how we can categorize this as a meets versus an approaching. But for now, we're asking for 2 opportunities, and then that must language is bolded because it needs to be included within their response. Again, they have the option of including evidence. They may submit something such as a description of the opportunity in which candidates engaged during preparation that is exemplary of hitting on this idea of student difference. So they may address it completely within their narrative response, or they may choose to connect some evidence to this response as well. I'll pause here and see if anyone has any questions about this. Okay, we got a question related to Rubric 4 that I'm going to address, and then I'm going to go back to Rubric 3 and address a question with that in particular. So we had a question about student difference, and they were interested in giving an example of an opportunity that EPPs might engage their candidates in to demonstrate this criteria. And so I can think specifically about under responses must include and position students as knowledgeable and valuable contributors of information regardless of their speaking or writing proficiency. And so what candidates might be engaged in during their coursework or within their practice is they might be thinking about the linguistic abilities of students within that they're either directly working with or have had experience with or have not had experience with and are just learning about linguistic differences across students. And so a linguistic difference that we might see is thinking about how a student or a child comes from a background where oral tradition is, an oral communication is very prevalent, and we see that the way that they respond in classes is while a teacher is reading a book out loud, they get really excited and interrupt constantly to chime in and give their 2 cents and their opinion because they're so excited. And what we can learn about this is that in preparation, we'll be learning that students respond differently depending on their backgrounds and abilities, and we can see that this may be commonplace at home, in that when families are engaging in a lot of exciting conversation, that they take the opportunity that when something reminds them, when somebody says something, that they just jump in and they get excited and they respond back and forth. And what we begin to see is that this is just part of the understanding of that child's background and culture. And to consistently in preparation shut down a child for interrupting, we can see that this is just a misunderstanding between how a child is relating to a story and to conversation. And so an opportunity may be to have a class discussion or to engage in a particular reading that describes these varied backgrounds of students and how they respond. And so this might be an example of an opportunity that EPPs would engage their candidates in. So a follow-up question to that, do the opportunities have to be with or from real students, or could the opportunity be with like a hypothetical set of students? And really the answer can be both. It's really the point in Ed Prep is to think about how we're preparing candidates to work with students across varied, diverse backgrounds and experiences. And so even though the population that candidates may be working with directly in the field may not be illustrative of some of the differences of our population as a whole, I would still be encouraging EPPs to be thinking about this more broadly. Okay. So I'm going to go back to Rubrics 3. We just had kind of an organization question about that. Question 3 on your proposal template is about candidate assessment, and it's organized on the template where it says 3, A, B, C, and D. Now, it is organized in the same fashion on the literacy rubric, although it does not use the labels of A, B, C, or D. And so if you're looking at your literacy rubric, what you'll see is question 3 for early elementary programs. On the left-hand side with meets expectations, you'll see 4 darkly colored circle bullets underneath that, and that equates to, you'll see one says at least one of the submitted assessments requires the candidates to engage, et cetera, et cetera. That corresponds to 3A. The next one corresponds to 3B. The next one 3C, and then the next one 3D, and that's for early and elementary programs. Now the next part of the rubric is for special education programs only, and it's organized in the same way. So 3A would correspond with at least one of the submitted assessments, requires the candidates to engage, et cetera, et cetera. The next dark colored bullet would be 3B, and then the following 3C, and the following 3D. So I'm hoping that was clear, because that was a good question. Okay, if there aren't any more questions about the fourth question in criteria, I'll go ahead and move on to question 5. This is about professional learning, and before I get into this, we had a good question about what is professional learning, and we've put a link to professional learning that is specific to the language used within our policy. Right there with Standard 5, it articulates professional learning. And another thing we wanted to add on to that is to think about how professional learning can occur in both EPP coursework as well as in the field. So professional learning, you could do, for example, mock conversations during, mock PLCs, for example, within preparation so that candidates are understanding how PLCs are composed and what goes on during those and who engages. So professional learning, we might think of being outside of the classroom, but it can actually, I think it would be fair to say that professional learning could happen within both coursework and field experiences. So with that, the question asks to provide at least 2 examples of how EPPs ensure that candidates will engage in professional learning about literacy during the preparation program. And the standards from this, the standards under Standard 5, the sub-indicators will really be helpful in thinking this through. In fact, a lot of the responses may include bullets underneath there or taken directly from that standards language. And so EPPs will be asked to think about engaging candidates in professional learning, such as collaboration with peers, school-based assessment team members, and reading and other specialists to select appropriate assessments and interpret data to inform instructional planning for students who are either experiencing literacy difficulties or English language learners, anyone who may need that extra assistance. Another response might include engagement with professional learning communities and evidence-based inquiry and decision-making grounded in theories of literacy and literacy practice. And finally, communication of literacy assessment information to various audiences. So again, this is an opportunity for, although we are looking for responses specific to literacy, there may be elements within the EPP program where candidates are being engaged in professional learning more broadly, that there can be ties directly to literacy in particular. So we're hoping that our EPPs are really thinking about this not necessarily just for literacy preparation, but just how in general they're thinking about that professional learning and then making, across the program, and making those direct connections to literacy. So the rubric rubric criteria reiterates those same bullets that were pulled from the standards and asks for the EPPs to, in their responses, include at least 2 opportunities for candidates to engage. So an example, again, might be engaging in those mock professional learning communities. Another example could be co-leading parent-teacher conferences that are focused specifically on literacy assessments, outcomes, and next steps for instruction. There's a variety of opportunities that EPPs may be engaging their candidates in to respond adequately to this question. I'll pause here and see if there are any additional questions about question 5. Okay, so I just wanted to reiterate the importance of that this training is really just about an overview so that everybody is very well vetted in this language of both the proposal and the criteria and to understand what the expectations are for the EPP. And we're going to spend a lot of time looking specifically at examples of responses that EPPs might be submitting so that you all feel very comfortable in reading this language and this criteria to the point where you can make those decisions as a reviewer. Real quickly, we got a clarification question. Co-leading parent conferences can be conducted during student teaching. Yes, absolutely. If it's set up intentionally by the EPP and providing that, some specific guidance and thinking about how candidates are really thinking about this being a professional learning experience, if it happens during student teaching, that would be fine. If you have any additional questions that you're thinking of, again, I want to encourage you to use that Google Doc link and articulate those questions as all of this is sort of sinking in. And I'm going to be looking at that Google Doc frequently, every few days or so, and uploading responses to those questions. Please keep in mind, if you have a question, more than likely other people have that same question. So making that addition to the Google Doc will not only be benefiting you, but probably your peers as well. Okay, so I'm going to transition us to talk a bit more about reviewer expectations. What you're engaging in currently is our half-day virtual training on February 15th. Your next training, official training, will be an in-person all-day training in March, and I sent out an email yesterday that we have selected March 28th as our in-person training. We are working on getting a space in Nashville to host that training, in or around Nashville, and we will continue to provide details about that training as it's upcoming. We may also ask, in addition to these two trainings, during the months of April and May, for you all to participate in what we're calling recalibration conference calls. And what that means is as you all are engaging in the actual review process with the proposals, and we're getting frequently the same questions asked over and over again, or we're seeing a potential misinterpretation or misunderstanding of criteria, we may ask for you all to jump on a conference call so that we can make some clarifications in regards to those misunderstandings or provide additional evidence or support if there is some questions. And so that's what we mean by recalibration conference calls. We received a question, can we come to May 28th in-person training as an alternate reviewer? Absolutely, we would encourage for you to do that. And we will keep our alternate reviewers on March 28th. We will keep all of our alternate reviewers up to speed in the same regard we are with our reviewers, so that everyone understands what those opportunities are and how we can keep you all engaged. In terms of pre-work, I'm using this term to talk a bit about the pre-work you already did in relation to this training, and that would include the review of the literacy standards and the proposal documents and selected read-to-be-ready resources. However, there is the expectation that from this point on, that you will continue to familiarize yourself with the EPP literacy standards, with the proposal template, and especially with that rubric criteria. So we really want to encourage you to spend time between now and March so that when we come in on March, we have a firm understanding of what all this language is, and we can just use it to spend time on those example responses. So I believe in part of your contract language, too, it does ask for you to engage in that pre-work, and that's what we are referring to anytime you see pre-work. I will keep up my correspondence via email to to encourage you to look deeply at particular resources. As there are questions that come in on the Google Doc or additional questions that we're fielding from EPPs themselves as they're completing this proposal review that we feel like needs to be communicated to you all, I will make sure to keep that communication up for you even between now and our March 28th date. So in terms of reviewing, I just want to touch on this because we'll get into a lot of this again in March, but the expectation for reviewing is that you all will be using criteria from Rubrics to provide analysis of the strengths and weaknesses of the proposal. I don't know if any of you have engaged in EdTPA training, but we'll follow a similar format in that we are asking for you all to evaluate the evidence that you see in a very unbiased, informative, and constructive way and highlight that evidence in relation to the rubric criteria in order to formulate the basis of your ranking of meets expectation, appropriate, or approaching, or below. And so this will be very evidence-based, and we will prepare you for looking specifically for that evidence in March using all of the instruments provided. So we wanted to ensure that you understood that you'll be well prepared to utilize these particular documents in order to feel confident about what you'll be doing when it comes time for the actual review. I wanted to touch briefly on the reviewer responsibilities to the EPPs. And what we've got listed here is we want to ensure that you're maintaining confidentiality of the review process. So as you are looking at proposals from EPPs, our expectation is you are not sharing or discussing with anybody or disclosing the information from the reviewed proposal. Clearly, I don't think anybody would, but we want to avoid making any sort of hostile or derogatory personal comments or criticism, whether that's during training or within the feedback that you're providing on the proposals. And of course, during this review, you want to be refraining from communicating directly with the EPP in any regard to keep the integrity of this review. In terms of responsibilities to the department, from now through the end of your contract, we are expecting that you will inform the department immediately if you're unable to review proposals in a timely manner, that you'll be talking with us if there's any potential personal conflicts of interest, and decline to review when the possibility of a conflict exists. I do want to mention that we will be removing any identifiable information from the proposals so that you will not know which EPP's proposal you are reviewing. However, if there's any sort of identifiable information, regardless of removing EPP institutions' names or any other identifiable information, we still want to ensure that you, if there's a way that you figured out who this EPP is and you determine there's a potential conflict of interest, we want to ensure that you're disclosing that to the department as soon as possible. We want to also ensure that you're complying with the department's expectations for the review. That means being proficient in what your contract language says and being able to commit to that, and that you're able to provide a fair, informative, and constructive critique of that proposal. Okay, I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions in regards to your responsibilities as a reviewer. Okay, I received a question that says, do I see in the contract that we will review around 30 proposals? That's a good question. You will be asked to review the proposal in its entirety. We put up to 30. We put between, I believe, 10 and 30 was on your contract. And we want to make sure that we have essentially a range there, because there's still, even though we've been asking EPPs to provide as much information as they can about the number of expected proposals they will be submitting, there's still this question about what we will actually receive from them. So you can expect to have up to 30 proposals reviewed during your contractual time, but you also need to know that it may not be that many. Okay, another question about the Google Docs link, and that was sent in an email from me yesterday along with the literacy rubric. And there's a link embedded in that email that you can click on, and it should take you right to that Google Doc. If you're having any kind of trouble accessing that, or you can't find it, I'm happy to send that information along again. Keep those questions coming. I'm going to talk about your immediate next steps after our training concludes for today. So after today and before March 28th, we want you to continue to familiarize yourself with the EPP literacy standards, with the teaching literacy and Tennessee document, with the proposal template and the rubric criteria, and to really click on and become well-versed in the resources and research embedded within the rubric criteria. So that's your task between now and then. And then again in March, we'll really hit the ground running in terms of providing those example responses and having you all engage with the criteria in sort of a mock reviewing with support training. And then if between now and then there are any reviewer questions that you have, whether it's about content, whether it's about logistics, please list them on our Google Doc, and I'm happy to address those as they come in. So with that, I'll open up for you all to ask any other final questions or any other final comments. Okay, I haven't received any questions via chat. Looks like we're ending early. I don't think anybody has any complaints about that. Give you an hour back of your life. We will spend some time here for the next 10 minutes or so and leave our WebEx on and unmute if anybody wants to talk directly to us for the next 10 minutes or so. However, this does conclude our reviewer training, and we'd like to thank each and every one of you for sticking with us and engaging, asking really good questions. We're really excited about this and are looking forward to seeing you all in March, and hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week. Thank you. Hi, everyone. If you're still hanging on and have any questions you'd like to talk with us, we're available.
Amanda, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Linda O'Neill. I am a teacher, but I'm also adjunct on faculty. Would I be in conflict in providing supports and resources and ideas through the writing process, or do I need to stay out of that?
What institution, where are you an adjunct?
Pardon me?
Where are you an adjunct?
I'm an adjunct at Walter State Community College, but we also partner our teacher ed program with ETSU.
So I think that you could support ETSU if they requested that, but that would be a conflict of interest if we would absolutely need to ensure that you did not review ETSU's program, and we can do that on our end. And then I would discourage you from providing consulting to any other EPPs.
Okay, so do not consult with any other universities, right?
I would recommend that reviewers only consult with their own university.
Okay.
And I would count ETSU as your university since that's your affiliation where the proposal would be developed.
Gotcha. Okay, well that came to my second question, Amanda, because I'm right here in Knoxville, and I'm often asked questions from professors in teacher ed programs at some universities and colleges in that area. So I just need to stay out of that, right?
Well, I think if they're asking you questions about the proposal process, then I would say no. If you're talking with them about good literacy design, apart from the proposal process itself, then you could use your judgment call there. If you want to be really safe until the proposal process is done, you could just say until that's completed that you're going to refrain from engaging in those conversations.
Okay, I'll do that. So far the question is about design and just ideas on what this might look like for a practicum student. So I just want to make sure I wasn't in conflict. Thank you.
You're welcome.